What's up, guys? So today's video is going to be a viewer request, and I had a viewer contact me on Facebook with wanting to know some information about brakes because they're looking at possibly doing some upgrades on the brakes on their cars. They had a lot of questions and it was hard to put into a simple answer. So I'm doing this video for them, and this is just going to be a lot of basic information on how the different brake components in a disc brake system work. I am not going to get into drum brakes for the sake of this video, but this is the basics on how brake systems work and what upgrades can be done. So for the most part, when it comes to rotors, bigger is better, but it's important to remember that all of that improvement does come at a cost. Rotors like this, which are a pretty good size, especially made entirely of cast iron, are very heavy. That extra weight is going to slow the car down. It is unsprung weight, which is very important. And also, you have to remember that the brakes are only as effective as the tires you pair them with and how much tire is on the ground. Once the brake's ability to slow the car exceeds the tire's ability to hold the car to the ground, anything beyond that is a waste. At that point, you're adding weight and you're not reaping any benefits. As a matter of fact, you're making the brakes very sensitive and very hard to use correctly. Rotors, for the most part, are going to come in a couple of varieties. You're going to either have vented rotors like this one, which, as you can see, are open in the middle with vents that go all the way through. This allows air to circulate through the central part of this rotor, which helps it stay cool, also allowing it to be quite a bit thicker. You will also have sometimes what are called composite rotors, which have a hat made of a lighter material than the disc, which helps to keep your unsprung weight down when you're running larger rotors. Those do tend to be more expensive though. There is, even in the performance world, such thing as a two-piece rotor, which essentially will usually have an aluminum hat which bolts to an iron disc. Those are on the higher end. They tend to be a little more expensive, but they save quite a bit of weight, allowing you to have a very large rotor without quite as much of a weight penalty. Other than that, there's two things that you need to look at when looking at upgrading brakes. One is the thickness. Now, the rotor being thicker isn't going to make the car stop any harder, but it will increase the rotor's ability to dissipate heat, which means you can be harder on them without having any adverse effects. The second thing you have to look for, though, is the overall diameter. And that's because you're trying to stop the hub in the middle and the pad is grabbing the rotor out here. Now, the distance here is what determines what the brake pad's mechanical advantage is in trying to stop this hub from turning. It's essentially the same as you putting a small rotor on is like trying to turn a bolt with this ratchet. Putting a larger rotor on is like trying to turn the same bolt with this ratchet. So going from a 12-inch rotor to a 13, 14-inch rotor, even with the same pad size, is going to increase how effective those brakes are, which means you're not going to have to brake as hard, which means that you're also not going to be as hard on the brakes. Pads are all about friction, and one of the things that causes more or less friction is this pad compound. There are a few different types. Most of the street cars come with either organic, semi-metallic, or ceramic brake pads. Most street pads are designed with noise and dust in mind so as to keep them easy to live with. If you're looking at performance brake pads, keep in mind that often the more high performance a brake pad is, the dustier it's going to be, possibly the more likely it's going to make noise. Sometimes even race style pads don't even grip very well until they're hot because they're engineered to perform well while they're hot, while they're being used. This makes them not such a great everyday street pad. The other thing to look at is pad size, because like I said, friction is what brake pads are all about. Now, if you have this much pad contacting the rotor versus this much pad, it's pretty obvious if you apply the same amount of force to these two, which one of them is going to apply more of a braking force to the setup. So when you're looking at changing brake setups out, how much contact area you have in the pad is also important. And when it comes to single piston calipers, you're generally going to have to expand this way. And then if you're going with dual or 4 or 6 piston calipers, that's when you start seeing pads getting longer, but it's essentially doing the same thing. There's just only so much pad that can fit in a given type of caliper. So next up is calipers. This is a stock caliper off of a 99 Grand Prix. And I'm just going to use this to show you some of the components. The caliper is the hydraulic component that actually applies the braking force to the pads, that pinches them together and slows the rotor down. So important things to note here, this is the piston right here. This is the actual part that moves, that does the actual work. Now this is what's called a floating caliper, which means it attaches to the bridge with these slide pins, so that when the piston comes out, the entire caliper can slide back, which is what applies the outboard pad. There are also what are called fixed calipers, and fixed calipers don't have that. They have opposing pistons, one on each side, so that both of them can move, and then the actual caliper is mounted fixed and doesn't slide. Okay, that caliper would be called a floating single piston caliper, because it has, if you look at the cross section of this, it has a single piston in the middle that moves in one direction and the caliper slides, like I said. Now, floating calipers, there are basically 2 variations you're going to see. There are single piston calipers, and to show it from a different angle, that would look like this if you were to look at it head on. Then there are also what's called dual piston calipers, which just have 2 pistons, which are smaller side by side instead of the one big caliper, or one big piston. Often the 2 smaller pistons displace less fluid, which means that the master cylinder doesn't have to be as big and still apply the same amount of force. The relation to the piston size in the caliper versus the piston size in the master cylinder change how well the brake pedal feels, how stiff the brake pedal is, and that sort of a thing. Now, other than floating calipers, there are also what are called fixed calipers, and fixed calipers have pistons that oppose each other, and that's how they're able to apply force from both directions. They come in 3 common varieties. If you're looking at a cross section here, basically you're either going to have a dual piston caliper that there's a piston on each side and they push in like this. You can also have 4 piston calipers, which have, as the name would suggest, 4 pistons. And then in higher end applications, you will even see 6 piston calipers, which have 2 rows of 3 like that. Some of the reasons why there are so many pistons in some of these calipers is because you have to remember that a rotor is not a straight flat surface. So if you have a curved rotor like this, and you keep making the brake pad bigger and bigger and bigger, if it was to stay the same shape, eventually you would wind up being so long that it stuck off the edges. Being able to do multiple pistons and arrange them in different ways means you can have a curved rotor, have a piston here, and a piston here, and a caliper that's shaped like this, and you can apply good even pressure all the way across the rotor without having to apply pressure where you don't want it to be. So the advantages to going with larger calipers when looking at brake upgrades would be 1, larger pads. Another upgrade that you can look at when you're looking at changing calipers is lighter materials. And basically what we mean by that is a lot of these dual and 6 piston calipers and stuff also are aluminum versus the factory cast iron or cast steel. So sometimes you can get more pressure while at the same time dropping some weight off the car, which is a big plus also. And basically what that means there is if you've got X amount of volume that this can move by moving a certain amount of distance. and then you've got that amount of fluid pushes this piston so far, and then you change this out, and say you go with some huge 6-piston setup. Now you need more fluid to move these pistons the same distance. Small changes are not going to hurt because most of the time the master cylinder is more than it needs to be anyway. But if you wind up with a situation where now you need a lot of fluid here and this just isn't moving enough, then what you're going to wind up with is a spongy or a low brake pedal that's never really going to feel very firm. And of course the solution to that would be to upgrade the master cylinder, which may be more challenging on some cars than others. It just depends on your setup.
So where do you get these brake upgrades from? Well, if you have one of the more popular platforms, if you have a Mustang or a Camaro or a Corvette or something, undoubtedly there are hundreds of companies that make bolt-on brake upgrades, and the budget is the limit as far as how aggressive and how big you want to go. If, however, let's say you have a less popular platform, you may not find as many readily available bolt-on kits. You will, however, have a couple different sources. One, if you're good at fabricating, there are companies like Wilwood that make what are essentially universal or race car brake setups that you can adapt to almost any car, but that's going to require fabrication. It's not going to be an easy bolt-on. Aside from that, if you have a platform that has at least been used a lot, odds are there are variations on the brakes in those cars and on cars that share the chassis somewhere else. And more than likely there are upgrades that can be found within stock vehicles. Since I generally cater to the W-body crowd, I will list right here a few of the easy factory bolt-on swaps that will improve your braking just using stuff you can get from the junkyard. Other than that, if you can find another car that shares your platform, odds are the company uses the same hubs for both, and there's a good chance that they're going to fit. You're going to have to do your research for this. You're going to need to go look on forums and see what people have done, or whatever, but there are definitely setups out there. For example, just to show you what I'm talking about, my 97 Grand Prix has front brakes from an 01 Impala on them. And the Impala and the Grand Prix are the same chassis. They're both W bodies. They both have the same knuckles. And the only difference was, I think because Chevy used the Impala as a fleet car and also a police cruiser, that they chose to go with larger rotors in the front. All you have to do, go to the junkyard, find those caliper brackets, find those rotors and pads. You can swap all the stuff over to a Grand Prix and improve the front brakes for actually not very much money. So these are the kinds of things that you can look into, but there are plenty of options. Just with this video, I'm not going to necessarily point you at specific options. I'm just going to tell you how to look at and evaluate what you're getting. So I hope that was helpful and that answered some questions that some of you guys may have. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments and I'll answer them as best I can. Other than that though, if this video was helpful to you, make sure you hit the like button. I do use how many likes I get on videos as a way of sort of determining what kind of things to look into in the future. So it is important, so please do that. In other channel news, the new shirts are available now. There'll be a link to my Teespring down in the description, so you can check that out. Also touch base with me on other social media. I will have those links all down in the description as well. I am on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and I respond to everyone that I can on all of those. And other than that, I will go ahead and let you guys go for this video, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.